this is kind of the plan that we're going to follow for today's, for the lecture of today and next one, which is in 2 weeks. So today we'll be mostly focusing on a theoretical explanations of how positive interactions evolve. It can be among plants, it can be among any two types of organisms. This will come in handy when we will be talking about mutualisms in general. So the next time we see each other, I'm going to go into a review of several examples of mutualistic interactions and what do we know about their evolution. So we will focus a lot on facilitation, plant-plant interactions, positive plant-plant interactions. There is a big chunk about endosymbiotic mutualistic interactions, so that happen between a plant and usually microorganisms, but not necessarily. And depending on how much time we have, I will talk about plant-animal interactions other than plant-pollinator interactions, because that we will cover for a whole lecture at the very end of the course. So starting off with the question straight away, based on everything that you have seen in the course so far, or everything that you know, can you give me examples of positive interactions? It doesn't even have to be plants, like anything you can think as a positive interaction.
Between the bacteria and the plant, about the nitrogen?
Yeah, the nitrogen fixating interactions. That is a good example. I'm pretty sure you could all think of at least one, or maybe even more. I can think of one, like I hopefully give you knowledge, and then I get paid by the university to do that. So hopefully it's mutually beneficial for all of us.
Maybe like ants. They can eat like other, I don't know how is it in English, but they can like eat other ants to protect the plant.
Like the myrmecophyte trees, the ants that are protecting trees from other insects. That is definitely a positive interaction. Anything else? How about the social security and pension system? We are all helping out the elderly so that the state or the social security system would help us when we're elderly or sick. It's not a direct interaction between individuals, but we're sacrificing some part of our salaries in order to have some gain in longer term. So what I'm aiming at is that interactions, most of the time, have a cost for the individuals, right? Especially if they're negative ones, they only have cost for the individuals. But when you have a positive interaction, you have a cost for the individual, but you also have some benefit from this type of interaction. And for the interaction to be positive, you need to have more benefit than the actual cost. And we will see how that works today. So the types of mutualism or positive interactions or cooperation, I tend to use cooperation and mutualism interchangeably because they're kind of the same thing, can be classified in many different ways depending on how do you study them. And one way to classify them is according to the things that you exchange. So we can have resource for resource interactions, which happens in the mycorrhiza, where the plant is feeding the fungi that colonize its roots, and the fungus is providing the plants in nutrients that are difficult to obtain in the soil, such as phosphorus. So both of them are trading photosynthetic resources for phosphorus. Then you can have resource for service interactions, such are the plant-pollinator interactions. Obviously, pollinator provides the service of pollination, and the plant provides resources. And what Eva said already, the service for service interactions, where such is the case of myrmecophyte trees, where the tree gives shelter and ground to live for the ants, and the ants are protecting the tree for other types of invaders. Now, this classification is obviously human-made, and it's not perfect, and it doesn't always apply. For instance, we know that the fungus in a mycorrhizal association can also protect the tree from pathogens. So then you have resource for pathogen exchange. The plants, the myrmecophyte plants can also feed the ants. So you have service for resource exchange. It all depends from what point of view do you want to study this interaction. And obviously the opposite of a positive, mutually beneficial interaction such as cooperation would be exploitation. So this is an interaction where one organism is benefiting from the interaction at the expense of the other. It exploits the other organism. So I'm always saying how cooperation, and everybody's saying how a typical example of cooperation is pollination, but we also have typical examples of exploitation in plant-pollinator interactions. So this orchid mimics the sexual partners of this bumblebee by its shape, colors, and also by the olfactory indices, like the scent of the flower. The bumblebees will come to the orchid, try to mate with it in different ways. They don't succeed at it, they move on to the next orchid, carrying the pollen in them. So the orchid is definitely getting pollinated. The bumblebee is getting nothing out of it, but even more so, the bumblebee is actually losing resources because it takes energy and time to mate, to find a suitable mate and to mate with them. And the more they spend time mating with these false orchid partners, the less energy they will have to mate with an actual partner. So a bumblebee that hasn't wasted all of their energy can beat them into the race for finding a suitable mating partner. And on the other extreme, you have bumblebees that have evolved to simply steal the nectar from flowers by piercing them in their tube. The nectar is situated around here somewhere. They pierce the tube, they drink the nectar, they walk away, and because the pollen is on this end of the flower, there is absolutely no benefit for the flower. So we have an interaction that started off very nicely, two organisms exchanging services and resources, and for these species in particular, it kind of turned sour. Like it evolved in a way that's, well, one is clearly exploiting the other. So what happens in this case? Like the net outcome of an interaction of when one organism is trying to cooperate because the flowers are still making nectar, the bumblebees are still trying to do the pollination thing. What happens if one organism cooperates and the other one doesn't? Which one do you think is going to win? The cooperator, the exploitator, or they both simply lose?
Well, I think that the cooperating organism might win, but like the cooperation won't work, so we could maybe like say that neither organism wins.
On the long term, I absolutely agree with that. Like, because once you break down the interaction, if one of the organisms stops the cooperation, the cooperating organism is simply not getting any benefit. So in the case of plants and pollinators, if the plant stops being pollinated, it will stop producing seeds. If it doesn't make any seeds, there will be no more plants. So for the next season, the pollinator will have no more food, simply because it didn't pollinate the plant efficiently. But what happens if we have just one interaction, like one plant meets one pollinator that is cheating? Which one is going to win in this case? Like, which one has the net gain of this kind of exploitative interaction?
Like the non-cooperating took everything or the resources from the one which is cooperating.
Yeah, exactly. So in a simple interaction between two organisms, whoever gets most of the resources, most of the benefit is the one that clearly wins. And this is kind of the contradiction, a contradiction between these two, because on one hand, if you have a single interaction, you tend to win everything if you're cheating. On the other hand, on long term, you don't get to win if you're not cooperating. So how is it possible for cooperation to evolve, starting from a single interaction where it is clearly more beneficial to be cheating? And that's what we'll be trying to figure out today. And even Charles Darwin actually was kind of not convinced that cooperation can evolve. So he quoted that if it could be proved that any part of the structure of any one species had been formed for the exclusive good of another species, it would annihilate my theory, that being the origin of species evolutionary theory, for such could not have been produced through natural selection. So in plain English or modern English, what he is saying is that Natural selection cannot create organs that are specifically destined to be beneficial to another species, which is kind of true, as we will see later on. But maybe because of this point of view that was very early established since evolutionary biology came to be as a science, the study of positive interaction and cooperation has been quite neglected. And you can see here the publications about facilitation, so positive interaction or competition, negative interactions between plants, and how they have, how many papers, scientific papers were published on each of these topics. And in a span of, that's like, what, 10 years? 10 years. You can see that in some years, there's up to 10 times more papers on competition than on facilitation, facilitative interactions between plants. And it's not that these interactions don't exist. It's simply that we tend to give more attention to the negative interactions or exploitative interactions. So how is it possible for cooperation to emerge is nicely explained in this video. So I'm just gonna let you see it.
Stated Clearly presents, how does cooperation evolve? Usually when we think of natural selection, we think of competition, survival of the fittest. Competition is fierce in nature, but almost everywhere we look, we also see examples of cooperation. When two or more different species cooperate to make a living, scientists call it mutualism. One of the craziest examples of mutualism can be found in lichen, those crusty things you often find growing on rocks and tree bark. Lichen is a combination of fungus and algae, two completely unrelated organisms working together as one. This cooperation is fairly unexpected because many species of fungus actually eat and kill algae. They have special tentacles called haustoria that pierce the cell walls of their victims, acting like straws to slurp out a meal. In lichen, however, the fungus uses its large body to collect moisture and vitamins from the environment, which it then gives to the algae. In return, the algae then uses photosynthesis to produce food that the fungus slowly eats, being careful not to injure or take too much from the algae. In hindsight, it's easy to see that this relationship gives both creatures a survival advantage. It allows them to thrive in places they could never dream of living on their own. But how do relationships like this first get started? This is a problem because if we imagine an environment with plenty of algae to eat, it seems that natural selection can only favor fungi with mutations that allow them to eat fast and multiply quickly. Slower, gentler fungi will always lose the competition, making it impossible for cooperation to evolve. By modeling natural selection mathematically, however, scientists have discovered many situations that actually promote the evolution of cooperation. One possible example would be an environment with small patches of slow-growing algae. Here, fast eaters will still outcompete slow eaters if they happen to find themselves on the same patch of food. Once the algae is gone, however, the fast eaters will starve. When slow eaters happen to find patches that fast eaters haven't yet found, the simple fact that they're slow gives their food more time to reproduce, sometimes even forming bridges to new fresh patches of algae that nobody else has access to. In this scenario, natural selection actually favors the nice guy. Survival of the slowest. If a mutation crops up in a fungus making it so slow at eating algae that the cells can actually grow and reproduce while being eaten, the fungus will never run out of food. Like a farmer that gets more fruit from her trees by carefully tending to their needs, from this point on, any mutation in the fungus that helps serve the algae will also help the fungus. So to sum things up, even though natural selection often forces living things into brutal competition, scientists have discovered many situations in which nature favors cooperation, even turning savage parasites into gentle, caring hosts. These relationships develop not because individuals decide to work together, but because circumstances of the environment naturally select for cooperation. I'm John Perry, and that's the evolution of cooperation stated clearly.
So back on Darwin's message, one thing that he clearly overlooked when saying that cooperation should not be favored by natural selection is that he was saying how no structure should explicitly evolve to sustain another species. And I think the case with the algae-eating fungus clearly summarizes that this is kind of what didn't work out in Darwin's reasoning, because the algae didn't evolve to be slow eaters, they didn't do it on purpose, but just by chance, because they were in the right environment, with the right eating strategy, so the right environment was the fragmented environment, with the right feeding strategy, the slower one, cooperation was able to evolve. But the fungus, yeah, it was the fungus eating the algae, didn't specifically do, oh, I'm going to be nice to these algae, so I'm just going to stop eating them as fast so they can have the time to reproduce themselves. It's just like a set of circumstances that kind of managed to give this result.